The United States today is a country with levels of inequality that harken back to previous centuries. More than 1 in 100 Americans is in prison. 3 times as many Americans are in jail right now than Chinese people. And the population's a little smaller. Warfare is a national identity for many people. It's a country which is drowning in debt, both personal and national, and which is gripped by fear and insecurity, increasingly expressed and exploited in the form of xenophobia and intolerance of immigrants. And I think these are some of the things that we have to look forward to if we continue the economic path that we're on. But it doesn't have to be, and in truth, what's been really bracing for me to remember is that Canadians really do have a different set of core values. In this country, you can appeal to the public interest. For heaven's sake, you can have an organization with public interest in the title, and it doesn't immediately elicit the sort of peals of derisive laughter that you get in the United States when you talk about good government or the public sphere or the public interest, where that kind of talk has been the subject of a 35-year campaign of extermination. And to talk about the positive role of government in society is virtual heresy in America today. So the title of this talk is Privatization, the Fundamental Struggle of Our Time, and I really don't think that's any exaggeration. The notion of privatizing public good speaks to the underlying philosophy of how society is organized, what government is for, whether government is a reviled whipping boy for the political right, or whether it's actually an expression of our collective will to get things done that we understand as selfish individuals socialized in a capitalist society we won't do unless we elect people to do it for us or do it to us or make us do it ourselves. That's a vision of government which might not be very romantic, but it's brought us the things about Canada that we still want to hang on to. And it goes directly to the heart of a vision of society, and there's a very stark and I think ever starker distinction between people who really believe, and I don't question the sincerity of this belief, but nor do I want to dignify it because it's fundamentally wrong, that we're all self-engaged cells battling out in a Darwinian battle of survival of the fittest, and that we all pursue our rational self-interest, and that's just who we are and what we are. And there's another vision of society which says, yeah, we're selfish, but we actually at our best see our fates as intertwined. We actually feel that what is happening to you is happening to me on any given day, and that the best expression of our country and of our society and of our culture is when we see each other connected. And I think in a time of environmental disaster, seeing connections and not seeing everything through the prism of competition is actually a life and death matter. So more concretely and understood in its broadest sense, privatization is the #1 factor that determines who controls the world's wealth and power, and in whose interest it is used. So here's what I want to do in the next 40 minutes or so. First of all, I'd like to broaden the scope of what we mean when we talk about privatization and talk about some of the things that I think we have to address when we talk about privatization so that we don't sound like nerds, policy wonks, and people who are obsessed with KPMG reports, which are very sexy, if you read them right. Second, I want to sort of report back to you from the frontiers of privatization around the world, some of which from my own experience and some of which from my research, and some of which I've seen firsthand in the United States in the past 3 months. Third, I want to bring the conversation home to Alberta and talk about Alberta as the front line in the battle against privatization in Canada, which I passionately believe it is. It's a perilous position to be in. It is also a position with tremendous opportunity and a chance for Albertans, despite how depressed you are about that noxious election, a chance for Albertans to actually recover some progressive pride and point the way forward in Canada. And I think that you have a tremendous opportunity there. I'll speak to that a little bit. And then I want to end by talking about, just briefly opening a discussion about responses to privatization, both here locally and internationally, and look at where pressure can be applied most effectively, because that's the theme of this conference. I'm absolutely thrilled that the conference is so action-oriented, is so focused on creating change and not having another talk shop and not doing more research. God bless the Parkland. I actually rely on their research every time I do anything in Canada, and they must never stop doing it. But it needs to fuel action. That's why they do it. So if we're not taking it and using it on the front lines of community and social debate, then it's just going to sit there on that beautiful website. So I want to end by talking a little bit about ways to address privatization. So first of all, broadening the scope. There's a lot of things going on in society today that are not technically considered privatization, but I think they are part of this ineluctable shift that we're experiencing, this slide into a more Darwinian world. And I think we need to talk about certain things when we talk about privatization if we want to connect the dots for people, and that's what it's all about. In order to fight the logic, we have to be clear about wherever it operates. So it's not just about selling off public services like daycare and healthcare and education and water, but in its broadest sense, privatization is anything that tilts society's balance and shovels public wealth into the coffers of big companies at the direct expense of the public interest. And once you start thinking about it in that way, all of a sudden we're talking about a much bigger range of things and many populist pressure points where we can do important work. So in the same breath that we talk about privatization, we have to talk about the piling on of personal debt and at the same time the nationalization of corporate debts. Because, of course, that's a key part of privatization. It's not just privatizing public assets, it's nationalizing private debts, otherwise known as corporate bailouts. They make the money, they take the risk. When they screw up, we pay them back. Now, we've had this unbelievable example of this in the United States in the past couple of weeks with Bear Stearns, one of the largest investment banks in America, gets itself into trouble on the way to making gajillions of dollars in this protracted economic boom. And then all of a sudden the Federal Reserve goes into emergency mode. They invoke obscure measures for the first time since the Great Depression. They have conference calls all weekend. God knows we'll be getting insider accounts and hardcover nonfiction books on the New York Times bestseller list in 6 months of how they all got on the phone together and they came up with a bailout plan for Bear Stearns. They spent $30 billion public dollars to help another massive investment institution, JP Morgan, buy it out and save the owners from losing the money that they had made. Meanwhile, the much vaunted economic stimulus package with which the Bush administration is going to show its Keynesian side and get in there and help Americans deal with the hard economic times that are coming, Americans get $600. 30 billion, 600. It's a tilt in society's priorities, and it's quintessential of privatization in the larger sense. When we talk about privatization, we have to talk about subsidies to mega profitable industries that suck wealth out of countries, out of the ground and out of countries. Now, my grandpa had fought a hell of an election campaign in 1972 on the slogan of corporate welfare bums. Now, you notice that corporate welfare has actually entered common parlance, and I'm fairly proud of him on a linguistic level that he popularized that phrase. They can't quite get the bums part out when they talk about it in the mainstream media, but nevertheless, in 1972, the amount of corporate welfare was such a pressing public issue that he fought the best election campaign of his life and resonated in communities across this country by identifying it, and people vibrated to that message. If he were alive today, what would he call it now? I mean, it was chump change back then. Now we're talking about corporate armed robbery, not just panhandling on the street. $1.4 billion in subsidies to the oil and gas industry in Canada. I mean, obviously oil prices are low, so they need help. Obviously, their profits are being punished, and we need the industry to be around because they're helping us, right? Because the trade deals that we've signed over the last generation require us to ship the vast majority of our energy straight over the border south.